All right, so here we go with our fourth and final. Coño, finally, whew, final part of our lecture on chapter 20. We're looking at Europeans in Southeast Asia. So here we have a painting, right? A Japanese painting. And here we see two Dutch guys, right, with some Japanese people. And the Dutch guys have a telescope, right? The Dutch are going to be a link between Japan and Europe. And in fact, there is a term is called Dutch learning. So it is through the Dutch that the Japanese are going to learn about a lot of those, European technologies. Now, keep in mind, of course, when we compare it, China, they traded, they only wanted silver, they didn't care for anything else, right? They weren't interested in technology and learning, you know, but the Japanese will be, right? Um, but even the Chinese, they're not gonna they're gonna restrict European access to China. So, for example, there's only two cities that the Europeans can go to. One is called Canton, the other one's called Macau. So when the Europeans show up to China, you know, um, they're gonna say, "Hey, look, we want to trade a whole bunch of cool stuff," and Chinese are like, "No, we don't care." And you can only come to the city. And when you get there, your ambassador he has to bow down, and perform the kowtow, right, on your knees, touching the floor to the awesome emperors of China. Now, again, we talked about this before. The Spanish, they had Southeast Asia. Their major colony there is going to be the Philippine Islands. The Philippine Islands were discovered, quote unquote, by Magellan, who is the famous Spanish explorer who is accredited for circumnavigating, sailing around the world. He goes to the Philippines and he says the Philippines now belongs to China. It now belongs to Spain. And then a whole bunch of Spanish people are going to come into the Philippines. They're going to conquer that place. And they're going to bring Jesuit missionaries. They're going to convert the Philippines into a Catholic country. And even to this day, a good chunk of Filipinos are Catholics. Uh, the Spanish are going to make a ton of money, or spend a ton of money, I guess. With their galleon ships filled with silver, they're going to trade with China for other good stuff. Now, in Japan, we see the Dutch, right? So the Dutch are going to be the only Europeans who can trade in Japan, and they can only trade in one city, right? Just like China. Um, and that city is called Nagasaki, and of course, you should know Nagasaki because Nagasaki was one of the two cities that was bombed with the atomic bomb during World War II. So long before that, Nagasaki was a trade city, a port city, and the Dutch would show up, right? They were allowed to come in once a year and supply, cool stuff to the Japanese. So even though the Chinese, they were, because they were so rich and powerful and self-centered and egoistical, and they thought they were the center of the world, and they didn't care for whatever the Europeans have to offer. The Japanese, they were a little bit more open-minded, right? And the Dutch came in, and through the Dutch, they learned about European technology, they learned about European science, they learned about European culture, right? So what was it that the Dutch did right, right? And what was it the Portuguese did wrong? Because the Portuguese were the first Europeans to get to Japan. The problem is that the Portuguese, right? They wanted to convert, right? It wasn't just trade; it was conversion. And at first, the Portuguese actually they set up churches and they set up Jesuit missionaries, and they actually convert people there. Um, but that eventually goes bad, and they kick them out. And the Dutch come in, and the Dutch are like, "Look, we're just here for business. We got cool stuff. You got cool stuff. Let's trade." And because they weren't as like pushy about it or aggressive about it, the Japanese are like, "All right, cool. We'll trade with you, but only you, no one else." Right? So the Dutch are going to be that link between Europe and the Americas, between Europe and Japan. I mean, all right. So here we see a map with Southeast Asia. We have India up here. We have China up here. Right, all these little places of Southeast Asia. Right, the Philippines, right, with the capital Manila, right there. Right, that major trade center for the Spanish Empire. Right, but let's look at Indonesia. Right. So of course we should know that the Portuguese get there. They're gonna set up shop. They're going to have their trading posts. But then the Dutch are gonna kind of push them out of the way, and they're gonna take over, right? And the country that we now call Indonesia, right, and Malaysia, they were known as the Spice Islands, right, including Malacca. Remember, Malacca is somewhere about here, if I remember correctly. And Malacca was that Muslim trading city, right? That Muslim city state in Southeast Asia. And the Dutch are going to take over this area. The Dutch are going to take over all these little islands of the Philippines, right? All these spice islands. And in fact, they're going to, through war, through the Dutch VOC, through firepower, the Dutch are going to colonize these islands, especially Java down here. And they're going to monopolize the spice trade. So we do see that the Europeans are taking control of Southeast Asia, right? Whether it's the Philippines or Indonesia. And it kind of makes sense why the Japanese are so resistant to opening up their borders to the Europeans. Because they just saw what happened to the Philippines. They saw what happened to Indonesia. And they're like, nope, we don't want any of that. So one city, Nagasaki, that's it. One people, the Dutch, that's it. We could say the Chinese were the same way. Right? The Chinese must have known what's happening in the Philippines and Indonesia, and they want to make sure these Europeans don't come in messing things up. Remember, by the 1600s, the Chinese are very much concerned about outsiders, right? They've always feared the Mongols, but now these European guys are showing up on boats with guns. You gotta be suspicious about that too. Right, of course, with the arrival of the Europeans, we see the arrival of Christianity, right? And which is kind of weird because most of us don't think of East Asia, of China and Japan when we talk about Christianity. But here's a history lesson for you all. Christianity was pretty popular in China for a long time, and in Japan for a long time as well. And in fact, Christianity's been there for a long time. Now, going way back to the Yuan dynasty of the Mongols, right, there's actually the first kind of like Christian missionaries. There's a group of Christians called Nestorian Christians. And these Nestorian Christians traveled the Silk Road, just like Marco Polo did. And they opened up the first Christian churches in China. And remember, this kind of makes sense because the Mongols had that open border thing. And they allowed everyone and anyone to come in, including these Christians, these early Christians. So even though Christianity has been there for a long time, it was a tiny percentage of the people who followed it, right? And when the Ming came in and the Qing came in after them, those churches were closed down. Those Christian populations kind of just disappeared because it was a foreign religion. It was a foreign belief system. And the native, Chinese didn't want anything to do with it, so those are gone. But then the Chinese show up, especially this guy. His name is Matteo Ricci, an Italian Jesuit. And he shows up with merchants, and he says, I have a lot of cool stuff I want to teach you Chinese people. And he's allowed to stay. And Ricci learns Chinese culture. He learns about Confucianism. He learns to speak the language, right? And he starts talking to the Confucian scholars. He starts talking and befriending the scholar gentries. And the reason he's respected and he's allowed to speak to these upper class people, because they respect him, because, yeah, he has a lot of cool technology, right? But he's gone out of his way to learn, to become one of us. So Matteo Ricci and his Jesuits that followed him, right, they take it upon themselves to convert all of China, right? They want to convert all of China and make it a Catholic country. And Jesuits, they convert people, right? So we see bureaucrats, merchants, administrators, they start converting. They become Catholic Christians, right? And we see a growing number of them within the bureaucracy, some of them getting high positions, right? And Matteo Ricci, his goal is, if I could convert the emperor, the head of this gigantic empire, the head of this bureaucracy, if I could get him to convert, then everyone will follow, right? And the way he's able to express or teach the Christian faith, the Catholic faith, to the Chinese. Take a wild guess. Come on, you know your world history. You should know this by now. Take a wild guess how Matteo Ricci, a Jesuit missionary, is able to convince people to switch to Christianity. Come on. There we go. He synchronizes it. He synchronizes Christianity with Confucianism. Right? And he says that the teachings of Confucius are really based on the teachings of of Jesus. Right? So by synchronizing Christianity and Confucianism, he's able to convert people, which is crazy. And 300,000 people convert. And of course that sounds like a huge number, but remember, China has, populations of like 200 million at this time. And eventually, news of what Matteo Ricci is doing over there in China eventually makes his way back to the Pope. And the Pope is like, wait a minute, you're synchronizing our Catholic faith with this Chinese philosophy? Heck no. And the Pope says, you're fired, you're done. Come back home to Italy. No more of this mission. So the Pope says, bye-bye, come back home. And then the emperor and the Confucian scholars, realizing that Ricci is gaining more and more influence in the empire, influence in the government, they're like, yeah, we got to kick this guy out. So eventually, Ricci and the missionaries, they are kicked out of China. They're told to go back home. Right? So the Chinese government didn't support them. The Pope didn't support them. So they went back home. But it was a temporary success for a while. And eventually, it went away. Now, let's talk about Christianity and Japan. So, remember, like I mentioned already multiple times, the Portuguese are the first to show up. And originally, the Japanese opened their borders to these Europeans. And with the merchants came the missionaries, and the missionaries started working on converting the Japanese. Right? And at first it works. And they convert a whole bunch of people. And the problem is, the Japanese, remember, they're very open-minded when it comes to religion and beliefs. Because the Japanese, remember, they have Shintoism, which is their native religion. But they also mix it with Buddhism. They also mix it with Confucianism. So to them, mixing and matching religious beliefs and practices and traditions, it's all good. But then when these Jesuit missionaries show up to Japan, they say, okay, from now on, only Christianity. Shintoism is wrong, Buddhism is wrong, Confucianism is wrong. In fact, let's burn down Confucian temples and Buddhist temples and Shinto temples, because there's only one true faith, only one God, Jesus, right? And that strikes a nerve, because Japanese, they like to mix and match. And eventually words spreads to the authorities, word spreads to the shogunate, and they tell the Christians, all right, you've got to go. We don't want you here anymore. Christianity is banned. The missionaries are banned. Right? And Japan expels them and tells them, get out or we'll kill you. And of course, these guys are super religious. These missionaries, they're there. And they say, look, we have a mission. Our job is to convert the Japanese people. We're not leaving. And then they get killed. And to kind of like add insult to injury, the Japanese, the shogun, is going to crucify these these priests, these missionaries, these Jesuits. Um, and then, once they kick out the Christians, they say, okay, you know what? Forget it. All the Europeans need to get out. Europeans seem to bring nothing but problems. And that's where we see that Japanese switch to that kind of like closing off of their borders. So even though they're not isolated 100% because they have the Dutch, they kind of close off from everyone else pretty much. And to kind of see this this pattern of Christianity spreading. Look at this image, right? This is a Japanese drawing, Japanese writing, in Japanese clothing, in Japanese style, right? But this is Jesus, right? The baby Jesus and the Virgin Mary, right? You see the baby carrying the globe with the cross on it, right? So Christianity existed in East Asia during this time period and had grown, to some levels of popularity. But it all eventually came in when China's borders went up and when Japan's borders went up. All right, so here we see a nice comparison between China and Japan during the early modern era. Right? It's almost as if, we can use this information to compare and contrast. Maybe like in an upcoming essay, compare and contrast China and Japan's response to the arrival of the Europeans. Interesting. Alright, so that's it for now. Thanks for watching. Thanks.